We are calling for a non-violent, peaceful march on Washington. And we want to go there not by the hundreds, not by the thousands, but by the hundreds of thousands.
Freedom Now movement, hear me. We are requesting all citizens to move into Washington, to go by plane, by car, bus, any way that you can get there. Walk if necessary. We are pushing for jobs, housing, desegregated schools. This is an urgent request. Please join. Go to Washington.
Half a century ago, on August the 28th, 1963, more than 250,000 people gathered in Washington, D.C. and demanded to be heard. The crowd that gathered that day stretched from the Lincoln Memorial, past the reflecting pool, all the way to the Washington Monument. The words that were spoken that day moved them deeply. 100 years after slaves were set free, black patience was almost exhausted. In the South that summer, African Americans didn't just march their way to freedom, they worked their way. It was sometimes bloody, and it was always hard. The road to Washington that day had been long and difficult. For many, it began when seamstress Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger, sparking a year-long boycott of city buses in Montgomery, Alabama. A boycott which ended when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that segregation on city buses was unconstitutional. The boycott also introduced the country to a young Baptist minister, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. In Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, 4 college students sat at a whites-only lunch counter and asked to be served. In the months that followed, hundreds more staged sit-ins throughout the South, until finally, the whites-only signs came down. A year later, scores of young Americans, both black and white, rode buses into the Deep South to test a Supreme Court ruling which outlawed segregation in interstate travel. One of the buses was firebombed, and many of the Freedom Riders were beaten and arrested. But the Freedom Rides had their effect. That fall, a federal commission issued new rules prohibiting segregation in bus stations, train stations, and airports. During this time, civil rights leaders like Dr. King were traveling throughout the South, organizing non-violent demonstrations in an attempt to integrate the cities. Demonstrators were almost always arrested. It was always dangerous, but never so much so as in Birmingham, Alabama. In the spring of 1963, Dr. King joined local civil rights leaders in organizing a series of mass marches from the 16th Street Baptist Church to City Hall. Despite hundreds of arrests, including that of Dr. King, the marches continued. Even children as young as 6 were taken to jail. Finally, the city's police commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, had had enough. He ordered police dogs and fire hoses to be used against the marchers. Pictures of the violence were shown on the network news that night. President John F. Kennedy said they made him sick. In his 1960 campaign, Kennedy had promised to end segregation with the stroke of a pen. After his election, many people sent him pens. But by the spring of '63, he had done almost nothing. Southern Democrats, whose support he needed in Congress, were opposed to civil rights. Then on June 11th, Alabama's Governor George Wallace stood in the schoolhouse door of the state university to block the entrance of 2 African-American students. Assistant U.S. Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach confronted him, but Wallace refused to step aside, forcing the president to federalize the National Guard. Wallace finally did step aside, allowing Vivian Malone and James Hood to register. That night, the president spoke to the nation.
The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free.
8 days after John F. Kennedy spoke on television, he sent a civil rights bill to Congress. It was the most important legislation for black Americans since President Lincoln freed the slaves. If it passed the Congress, African Americans could no longer be excluded from restaurants, hotels, and other public facilities anywhere. Civil rights leaders saw this as a turning point and decided to take the issue directly to the nation's capital. A giant march on Washington had been a civil rights goal for many years. A. Philip Randolph, the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a powerful black union, had first brought the idea up to President Franklin Roosevelt in 1941. Now, in the late spring of 1963, Randolph, King, and 4 other civil rights leaders agreed they would do it together. But John F. Kennedy was worried that a massive march, especially if violence broke out, would destroy any chances for his civil rights bill. He and his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, met with the civil rights leaders and asked them to stop it. Randolph replied, "Mr. President, this will be a peaceful, non-violent march. We are coming to Washington."